It happened at a dinner party in my own house, the home I built with my bare hands. My son-in-law raised his glass, smirked, and shouted, "Toilet King, your rule is over." Laughter erupted around the table. My daughter laughed. The guests laughed. Even my so-called friends chuckled as if humiliating me was some kind of entertainment. I sat there frozen for a moment, every word slicing deeper than the last. But instead of exploding, I smiled, pushed my chair back, and quietly excused myself. They thought the old man had accepted defeat. They didn't know that as soon as I stepped into the hallway, I dialed a number that would change everything. 45 minutes later, he was on his knees, begging. Before we continue, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. What would you do if your son-in-law publicly mocked you like this in front of family and friends? Would you walk away or make him pay? The smell of roasted garlic and slow-cooked lamb filled my dining room, a room I had built with my own hands more than 25 years ago. Every nail, every polished beam above our heads was the work of a younger version of me, a man who believed family would always respect the roof he provided. I had imagined laughter echoing in this house for generations. My children bringing their children, holidays spent together without judgment or cruelty. Back then, I never thought that one day I would sit at this same table and feel like a stranger. The long oak table was crowded that evening. Plates clinked, wine glasses chimed, and the hum of overlapping conversations rose against the warm glow of the chandelier. It was supposed to be a celebration, my birthday dinner of all things. But as I looked around, it didn't feel like my night at all. My daughter, Emily, moved gracefully between the kitchen and the dining room, carrying plates, making sure everyone was served. She had inherited her mother's warm smile, but lately I saw it less and less. Sitting beside her, like a king in borrowed robes, was my son-in-law, Richard. Richard had been part of this family for nearly 10 years, and from the very beginning, he carried himself with a smugness that unsettled me. At first, I dismissed it as youthful bravado, the kind of arrogance men wear before life humbles them. But over the years, his little digs grew sharper, his need to belittle me more frequent. It began with subtle comments about old-fashioned ways, mocking my tools, my hands, my work clothes. I brushed it off. Then it turned into jokes at family gatherings about how I was still swinging hammers while real men typed numbers into spreadsheets. He'd never once looked me in the eye when thanking me for anything I paid for. The down payment on their house, the loan I covered when he lost his job, or the new appliances I'd quietly purchased when theirs broke. Still, I stayed silent. For Emily's sake, I swallowed the insults. I told myself that keeping the peace was better than starting a war. But there comes a moment when even the most patient man feels the last straw snap inside him. That night was mine. As the dishes were passed around, the conversation grew lively. Guests leaned back in their chairs, glasses full, their laughter bouncing off the walls I once painted with Maria, my late wife. Richard tapped his fork against his glass, commanding the room as though it were his kingdom. He stood, raising his wine, and I knew from the gleam in his eyes that trouble was coming. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice dripping with theatrical pride, "a toast." The guests hushed, all eyes on him. Emily smiled nervously, sensing the edge in his tone. I remained still, a small knot tightening in my chest. Richard turned his gaze on me. "To our esteemed patriarch," he began, dragging the words out as though they were bitter on his tongue. "The man who still clings to his throne like some relic of the past." He paused for effect, scanning the room. Then he smirked, and the words fell like stones. "Your throne is a toilet, old king. Sit down and don't interfere." For a heartbeat, silence reigned, and then the room exploded in laughter. Guests slapped their knees, choking on their drinks, some wiping tears from their eyes. My daughter didn't laugh, not openly, but she lowered her head, eyes fixed on the table, lips pressed tightly together. She didn't defend me either. The sound of their laughter hit me harder than any insult ever could. It wasn't just Richard's cruelty. It was their complicity. My hands tightened on the armrests of my chair, knuckles pale. I looked around at faces I had welcomed into my home, people who had eaten at my table countless times, and not one of them spoke up. I wasn't a father or a host or even a man to them in that moment. I was a joke. Inside me, rage burned, hot and merciless. But I did not slam my fist on the table. I did not shout or storm out in anger. I did something far worse. I smiled. I leaned back in my chair, nodded at Richard as though he had won some great battle, and let the laughter fade into the clinking of forks on plates again. They thought they had silenced me, reduced me to nothing. What they didn't know was that silence can be more dangerous than fury. I stood slowly, pushing back my chair. The room barely noticed, too busy chuckling and whispering over the so-called joke. "Excuse me," I said softly, my voice steady, controlled. Richard didn't even glance up. He was too busy basking in the attention. I walked into the hallway, past the photographs of family vacations I had paid for, past the portrait of Emily as a little girl on her first bicycle, a bike I had built from spare parts when money was tight. My throat tightened, but not from grief, from resolve. I pulled my phone from my pocket. For months, I had been carrying a number. Tucked away for the day, I finally decided enough was enough. That in-house day had arrived. I pressed the contact and lifted the phone to my ear. "Hello?" A calm, professional voice answered. I looked back through the doorway, watching Richard laugh, his arm draped possessively over Emily's shoulders, guests eating and drinking in the house my hands had built. "It's time," I said. And with those two words, everything began to change. When I ended the call with John Harris, the banker who had quietly carried my secrets for years, I didn't go back to the dinner table. I stood there in the hallway, my back pressed against the wall, listening to the muffled roar of laughter seeping through the door. Richard was retelling his little toilet king joke for the second time, milking it for every ounce of attention. I heard chairs scrape, glasses clink. The kind of laughter that digs deeper than a blade because it says you're no longer a man, just a spectacle. I should have felt ashamed. But instead, a strange calm settled over me. John's words replayed in my head from months earlier. "Dennis, you can't keep doing this. You're propping up a man who's spitting on your sacrifices. One day, you'll regret it." I had brushed him off, too stubborn to admit the truth. But tonight I knew. John had been right all along. I turned toward my study, closing the door softly behind me, as though sealing myself away from the world outside. My desk was a mess of papers, manila folders stacked high, old bank statements shoved into drawers. I pulled them out one by one, spreading them across the wood like evidence in a trial. And in a way, it was a trial. Richard's. The first folder contained mortgage statements. My name, their address. Month after month, $2,700 transferred automatically from my account to theirs. I traced the numbers with my finger, remembering how Richard had come to me with Emily by his side, pleading, saying, "It's just until I get back on my feet, Dad. You understand." Emily had squeezed my hand, her eyes wide and wet, and I had nodded, even though my stomach churned. What choice did I have? She was my daughter. The second folder was thicker. Receipts from contractors, invoices for renovations. $18,000 charged to my credit card for the kitchen renovation Richard had demanded. Granite countertops are essential for entertaining, Dennis. It's an investment in our image, he had said with a smirk, as if appearances meant more than stability. I paid it because I didn't want Emily embarrassed. That was my weakness. I couldn't stand the thought of her feeling ashamed. Another folder? Loan documents. $50,000 yanked out of the equity of my own home to help them secure theirs. I remembered the day I signed those papers. The loan officer had looked me in the eye and asked, "Are you sure, Mr. Flores? You're putting a lot on the line." I had smiled and said yes. For family, I thought. Always for family. And then the credit cards. 4 separate accounts. Each one I had stepped in to rescue. Richard had maxed them on suits, gadgets, and failed business schemes. And each time, I bailed him out. The balances stared back at me now like scars, each one a reminder of how I had traded pieces of my own future for their comfort. All told, I had poured nearly $250,000 into that man's life. $250,000, gone into a pit that mocked me in return. My hands trembled as I closed the folder. I thought of Maria then. My late wife had warned me so many times. "Dennis," she'd whisper at night when I told her about another bill I was covering, "he doesn't respect you. He respects what you give. Stop before it's too late." I'd kiss her forehead, promise her I knew what I was doing. But what did I know? I had been a fool. Tonight proved it. I picked up my phone and dialed the second number, my throat dry. The line clicked, and a steady voice answered. "Lopez Collections." "This is Dennis Flores," I said. My voice sounded calmer than I felt. "I need you to initiate collection on all accounts tied to my name as guarantor. No extensions, no exceptions." There was a brief pause. "Do you want us to notify them immediately?" "Yes," I said, gripping the phone tightly. "I want him to feel it. Starting tomorrow." "Consider it done," Lopez replied. His tone was cold, efficient. "He'll be contacted by morning." When I hung up, the silence in my study was deafening. I stared at the papers still scattered across my desk, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a man with control. Richard strutted around like a king, but everything he had was mine. His house, his car, his lifestyle, it was all built on my back. Without me, he was nothing. Tonight, I had finally decided to show him what nothing felt like. The next morning, the world outside seemed brighter. I sat at the kitchen table, drinking my coffee slowly, savoring the bitter taste. For years, every sip had carried guilt. Guilt that I couldn't save more. Guilt that I was draining myself dry for their sake. But now it tasted like freedom. By afternoon, the ripples began. I wasn't there to see it, but I heard about it soon enough. Richard, never one to miss a chance to flaunt his imagined wealth, had taken Emily downtown. He'd marched her into a jewelry store, planning to buy her a necklace she had admired. He wanted to show her, and the world, that he was still the provider, still the man in control. He strode to the counter, card in hand, flashing that smug grin of his. The cashier swiped it. Declined. He laughed, shrugged, and handed over another. Declined again. His smile faltered. But he tried one more, beads of sweat starting to show on his forehead. Declined. The story was retold to me later by a clerk who happened to know one of my neighbors. Richard had gone red, muttering about a banking error. His voice too loud, desperate. Emily stood beside him, her face pale, her hands clutching her purse straps. The eyes of strangers burned into them as Richard snatched his cards back and stormed out, humiliated, dragging Emily behind him. I wasn't there to see it, but I didn't need to be. I could picture it perfectly. The panic in his eyes, the arrogance slipping like a mask cracked in half. That was the first brick pulled from his castle, the first taste of what it meant to bite the hand that had fed him for years. As I sat in my quiet kitchen that evening, sipping another cup of coffee, I allowed myself the smallest smile. The laughter from last night still echoed in my ears, but it no longer hurt. Because I knew the real laughter, mine, was only beginning. The necklace fiasco at the jewelry store was only the first stone to fall. Within days, the cracks in Richard's so-called kingdom began to spread, like fractures through glass. It started small, the kind of things a man like him thought he could wave away with swagger and a smile. A declined card here, a bounced payment there. But the world doesn't wait long to punish arrogance, and soon the signs became impossible to ignore. The mailbox at their house began to overflow with bills. Where once there had been glossy catalogs, flashy credit card offers, and invitations to social events, now there were envelopes stamped with heavy red ink. Past due, final notice, immediate response required. Their electric company sent 2 warning letters in a week. The gas bill went unpaid for a full cycle, and I knew because Emily came by one afternoon, her voice strained as she asked if she could borrow my washer since something was wrong with theirs. It wasn't broken. They'd simply stopped paying the utility bill. The neighbors noticed too. In a neighborhood like ours, whispers travel faster than wildfire. I overheard Mrs. Green, 2 doors down, telling her friend on the sidewalk, "Their lawn service hasn't been around in weeks. Richard always bragged about his perfect lawn, but look at it now. Weeds everywhere." Another neighbor muttered to me while raking leaves, "Emily's back to driving that old sedan instead of the Lexus. Guess they're cutting corners." People still smiled politely at Richard during the occasional block party or cookout. But I saw it in their eyes. They smelled weakness. The man who once strutted with polished shoes and slick words was becoming the subject of hushed speculation, the kind of gossip that clings tighter than smoke. And inside their house, the pressure was building into something uglier. Emily came by more often, usually under flimsy excuses, returning a dish, asking about a recipe, bringing over a newspaper. But her face told the truth. Her eyes were rimmed red from crying, her hands twisted nervously as she spoke. I asked gently once if she was all right, but she brushed it off with a brittle laugh. "Richard's just stressed about work. Things will get better." But I heard the strain in her voice, the cracks forming between her words. She didn't have to say it outright. The fights had already begun. I knew my son-in-law's pride, and I knew what happens when pride meets pressure. He was the type of man who could pretend to be in control for only so long before the mask slipped. And now it was slipping. Emily mentioned arguments over grocery bills, over why she bought fresh fruit instead of canned, why she left the lights on too long in the evenings. These were not the conversations of a man with confidence. These were the panicked outbursts of someone watching the walls close in, scrambling to find someone else to blame. I should have felt pity. Once upon a time, I might have. But I remembered that dinner table, the laughter, the sting of the word "toilet king" echoing in my ears while my own daughter stared at her plate. No, Pity was a luxury long gone. Now I sat on my porch in the evenings, sipping coffee and watching as their castle began to crumble brick by brick. It wasn't just the bills or the utilities. Richard's arrogance began to fray in public, too. I heard from one of his co-workers, a man I'd known from church, that Richard had been snapping at colleagues, shouting in meetings, blaming everyone else for mistakes. His reputation at work, once inflated by charm and bravado, was thinning fast. "He's not the golden boy anymore," the co-worker whispered. "People are starting to see through him." I stayed silent. That was my weapon now. Silence. While he flailed, I remained calm, untouchable, invisible. For years, I had been the silent safety net beneath him. Now I was the silent witness to his fall. And the silence was louder than any laughter could have been. The tension at home finally erupted 3 weeks after the infamous dinner party. I knew something was coming because Emily hadn't been by for several days, and when she finally appeared, her face was pale, her shoulders hunched. She carried herself like someone carrying stones in her chest. "Dad," she began softly, "Richard's under a lot of pressure. Maybe you could talk to him? Just ease things?" Her eyes pleaded with me, but I only shook my head. "Emily," I said, my voice calm but firm, "sometimes pressure shows you what a person is really made of. If he's the man he claims to be, he'll handle it." She bit her lip, nodded, and left. For the first time, I saw doubt in her eyes. Doubt about the man she had chosen over my guidance. That was Richard's doing, not mine. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the porch, I heard heavy footsteps on my walkway. I set my coffee cup down and looked up to see Richard approaching. The man who once strutted with smug confidence now looked haggard. His tie hung loose, his shirt wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot like he hadn't slept in days. The arrogance hadn't completely drained from him, though. It was there in the way he jabbed a finger toward me as soon as he reached the porch. "We need to talk," he said, his voice a mixture of fury and desperation. "And this time, you're going to help." I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I simply looked at him, my expression unreadable, and let the silence stretch. For the first time in years, Richard seemed unsure of himself. And for the first time, I felt no fear of him, no obligation, only anticipation. Richard stood on my porch, shoulders stiff, jaw tight, eyes bloodshot with exhaustion. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I simply looked at him, letting the silence gnaw at his bravado. His finger was still pointed at me, shaking slightly, not just from anger, but from something deeper. Fear. "You're going to help me," he said finally, his voice sharp and clipped. "I know what you've been doing. The banks, the cards. I don't know how you pulled it, but it's got your fingerprints all over it. And now you're going to fix it." I leaned back in my chair, lifted my coffee, and took a slow sip. The quiet slurp was the only answer I gave at first. His nostrils flared. He was expecting the old Dennis, the man who opened his wallet without hesitation, who rushed to smooth over every wrinkle in Emily's life. But that man was gone. "I'm not going to fix anything, Richard," I said calmly, "because nothing's broken. What you're experiencing is reality. For once in your life, you're living on your own terms instead of mine." His face darkened, a flush creeping up his neck. "Reality? Reality is I've got creditors breathing down my neck, utilities about to shut off, and a wife who can't even buy groceries without me checking the receipt. You think Emily deserves this? You think she should suffer just because you want to prove some sick point?" I let his words hang there, savoring them. "Emily's been suffering for years, Richard. You've just been too busy polishing your ego to notice. She's carried your moods, your debts, your failures, and when you couldn't stand on your own, you leaned on me. Not once did you thank me. Not once did you show respect. And then, after all of it, you stood in my house, at my table, and mocked me in front of everyone. His eyes darted away for a second, the memory flashing across his face. He shifted, his confidence faltering for just a moment. But arrogance dies hard, and he snapped back quickly. You're twisting it. It was a joke. Everyone laughed. You're too damn sensitive. I set the cup down with a deliberate thud. It wasn't a joke, Richard. It was the truth you've been too cowardly to admit. You've treated me like a toilet. Something to dump your problems into, something beneath you. But that throne you mocked me for, it's the only thing that's been holding up your kingdom. And I've finally flushed. His jaw dropped slightly, then snapped shut. He stepped closer, towering over me, but his height meant nothing now. You can't just cut us off. Emily is your daughter. At that, I stood, slowly, deliberately, until we were eye to eye. Emily is my daughter. And because she is, I'll never let her go hungry, never let her live without a roof. But you? I let the word drip with contempt. You're nothing to me. You're a leech who mistook kindness for weakness. The mask cracked then. I saw it, the flicker of fear in his eyes, the twitch at the corner of his mouth. He was losing ground, and he knew it. But pride is a stubborn master. He clenched his fists, his voice dropping low. If you think you can embarrass me, you're wrong. I'll find another way. You don't hold all the cards. I laughed, a dry sound that made him flinch. Oh, Richard, I hold every card, every loan, every guarantor line, every safety net you've ever leaned on has my signature. You built your empire on sand, and I was the tide. Now I've pulled back, and you're standing there, exposed. You can bluff all you want, but the truth is, without me, you're nothing but debt and noise. His face twisted in rage. You'll regret this, he spat. You'll regret turning your back on us? No, I said, stepping past him and opening the door wide. The only regret I have is not doing it sooner. He stood frozen for a moment, breathing heavily, fists trembling, before finally storming off the porch. His footsteps pounded against the walkway, each one echoing like a drumbeat of desperation. I didn't follow him. I didn't call after him. I simply sat back down, lifted my coffee, and stared out at the fading sunlight. My heart was calm, steady. For the first time in years, I felt like I had taken a piece of myself back. But peace doesn't come without echoes. Over the next week, I began to hear them. Emily's voice on the phone, soft but strained, asking if I had talked sense into Richard. Neighbors whispering louder now, openly questioning why Richard wasn't at work, why his car hadn't left the driveway in days. And then, from a friend in town, the first confirmation that my plan was sinking deeper. Richard had been denied a business loan renewal. His credit was in shambles, his reputation wobbling. The decline at the jewelry store was just the beginning. I thought back to the look in his eyes on my porch. Not just anger, but fear. He had come to me still believing he could command me, still believing the old Dennis would fold under pressure. But he left empty-handed, with the realization that the man he mocked was the man who held his future in a vice. And as the days passed, as the cracks in his castle widened into gaping holes, I knew it was only a matter of time before he came back. Not to demand, not to threaten, to beg. Richard leaves furious. But the father knows the tables are turning, and the humiliation has only begun. Richard tried to hide the unraveling. That was his nature. He'd rather drown in silence than admit he couldn't swim. But cracks have a way of showing themselves, no matter how carefully you paint over them. By the second month after the dinner party, whispers about his money troubles weren't just whispers anymore. They were open conversations. I caught them at the grocery store, in the church parking lot, even from the mailman who dropped off my letters with a knowing glance. Everyone could see it. The golden boy was tarnishing. And yet, instead of bowing his head and facing the truth, Richard doubled down. He decided to host a gathering at his house, an attempt to prove to the world, and maybe to himself, that nothing had changed. Invitations went out, hastily printed and delivered. Wine and hors d'oeuvres, the card said in bold letters. An evening of celebration. What was he celebrating? He didn't say. But pride rarely needs a reason. Emily delivered my invitation herself, her smile tight, her eyes dim. "Richard wants you there, Dad," she said quietly. Her voice trembled as if she already feared what the night would bring. I only nodded. The night of the gathering, I dressed simply. Pressed shirt, dark slacks. No suit, no tie. I didn't need to dress like a king. I wasn't there to impress. I was there to reveal. Tucked under my arm was a slim leather folder, heavy not with weight but with truth. Proof of every dollar, every loan, every sacrifice that Richard had buried under his arrogance. When I walked into their home, I saw the desperation immediately. Candles burned in every corner to disguise the faint staleness of a house where the utilities had been cut off and then hastily reconnected. Cheap wine sat in crystal glasses, as though presentation could hide the quality. Richard greeted guests at the door with his old grin plastered on, his handshake firm, his voice booming with forced cheer. He laughed too loud, clapped shoulders too hard, as if the volume of his performance could drown out the silence of his reality. "Dennis," he said when he saw me, his smile just a little too wide. "Glad you could make it. It means a lot." I only gave him a thin smile and stepped past. His eyes flickered to the folder under my arm, but he said nothing. The night wore on in a blur of small talk and strained laughter. Richard flitted about the room like a man trying to plug leaks in a sinking ship. But the guests weren't fooled. I caught them exchanging glances when the wine ran out too quickly, when the food was clearly bought cheap from the discount aisle, when Richard's stories about new business ventures sounded thinner than paper. The murmurs were starting already, buzzing at the edges of the room like gnats. And then, as though he couldn't help himself, Richard raised his glass. "To new beginnings," he shouted, his voice cracking just slightly. "To hard work and success, to family and strength." He looked at me as he said it, daring me to challenge him, daring me to expose him. I rose slowly, the folder still under my arm. "A toast," I said, my voice steady. The room quieted, eyes turning to me. Richard's smile wavered. "I'd like to propose a different kind of toast," I continued. "To truth, to sacrifice, to remembering where we come from, and who built the foundations we stand on." I opened the folder and began laying papers on the table. Bank statements, receipts, contracts. The rustle of paper was louder than any voice. "This house," I said, tapping a mortgage statement, "was paid for with my equity." I placed another paper down. "These renovations? My credit. These bills, these debts, these cards cleared over and over. My retirement, my savings, my labor." Gasps rippled through the room. Guests leaned forward, reading the numbers, the signatures. Emily's face went pale, her lips parting as she realized what I had brought. Richard froze, his hand gripping his glass so tightly it trembled. "This man," I said, my voice cutting through the silence. Stood in my home and mocked me as a toilet king. He laughed while I carried the weight of his failures. But what he didn't tell you, what he's never told anyone, is that without me, he has nothing. His throne is borrowed. His crown is counterfeit. His kingdom exists only because I allowed it. The room erupted in whispers. Some guests looked at Richard in shock, others in pity. A few shook their heads, disgust written plain on their faces. Richard's smile shattered, replaced by a mask of pure rage. "You had no right," he hissed, stepping toward me. "This is private. You think humiliating me makes you a better man. You think, I interrupted, my voice sharp, that respect is earned, not demanded, and you've done nothing to earn mine. Tonight, the truth belongs to everyone in this room. Let them see the man behind the mask." Emily covered her face, tears streaming down her cheeks. A neighbor put a hand on her shoulder, whispering comfort. Richard looked around, searching for an ally, but found only turned faces and lowered eyes. His kingdom had vanished in an instant. He slammed his glass down, wine spilling across the table. "This isn't over," he growled, his voice shaking. "You'll regret this." And with that, he stormed out of the room, leaving his guests in stunned silence. I gathered my papers calmly, sliding them back into the folder. My hands were steady, my chest light. For the first time, the humiliation was not mine to carry. It was his. But as I walked out into the cool night air, I knew this was only one battle. Pride doesn't die easily. Richard would not go quietly. He would claw, he would fight, he would try to rebuild. And that meant the real war had only just begun. After the gathering, word spread faster than I ever imagined. By the next morning, half the neighborhood knew about the mortgage papers I had laid out on Richard's dining table. Within 3 days, the whispers turned into blunt conversations. At the coffee shop downtown, I overheard 2 men talking openly. "That Jenkins guy? His whole life's been bankrolled by his father-in-law. A fraud, that's what he is." In the church pews, heads leaned together, murmurs about debts and dishonor. And at the grocery store, a cashier smirked when Richard's card declined for a second time. The chuckle loud enough for Emily to hear. Richard tried to fight back at first. He stormed into the bank 2 days after the party, demanding to see a manager. He wanted answers, demanded loans, begged for corrections. But the banker, John Harris himself, refused him politely but firmly. "Your guarantor has withdrawn his support, Mr. Jenkins," John explained, his tone almost clinical. "Your accounts are no longer backed. Without collateral, your credit profile cannot sustain further lending." That was it. The safety net was gone, and Richard had nothing left to cling to. His business associates backed away quickly. The few who had invested in his latest venture pulled out, citing financial instability. Invitations that once flowed freely into their mailbox vanished overnight. No more dinner parties, no more golf outings. The phone calls slowed, then stopped completely. The golden boy was radioactive now, and no one wanted to be near him. At home, the collapse was harder to hide. The Lexus was repossessed in broad daylight. Emily's neighbors watched from their driveways as a tow truck carried it away, their whispers cutting sharper than knives. Soon after, the credit collectors began calling. Emily came to me once more, her face pale, clutching a handful of letters. "Dad, what's going to happen?" she whispered. I wanted to tell her the truth, that she'd been living in a castle of lies. But instead, I only placed a hand on hers and said, "You'll survive. You always do." The strain between her and Richard grew louder each night. From my porch, I could hear their arguments through the thin summer air. His voice, once dripping with arrogance, now cracked with desperation. "It's your father's fault," he shouted. "He's sabotaging us." Emily's replies came softer, but firmer with each passing day. "No, Richard. This is your doing. He bailed us out for years, and you mocked him. You humiliated him." It was working. I could see it in her eyes whenever she came by. The veil lifting, the loyalty she had blindly given him beginning to crumble. For the first time in years, she saw him for what he was. A man who built nothing, who leeched off others, who bit the hand that fed him until there was nothing left. But pride doesn't die quietly. Richard began drinking more. I saw the bottles in their recycling bin piling up each week. His once pristine suits grew wrinkled, his hair unkempt. He stopped shaving, his eyes sunken, his steps unsteady. Yet, even in his decline, he clung to his anger like a lifeline. Every time he passed me on the street, he glared with hatred so thick I could almost taste it. And still, I said nothing. Silence was the blade I wielded now, sharper than any words could be. I let him stew in his failure. Let him feel the weight of every unpaid bill, every judgmental stare, every quiet night when Emily chose sleep over conversation. His arrogance, once so loud, had become a hollow shell. Then came the moment that sealed it. One afternoon, I was on my porch trimming the hedges when a black sedan pulled into their driveway. Two men in dark suits stepped out, briefcases in hand. They knocked on Richard's door with the kind of precision that said they weren't there to chat. Collection agents. I couldn't hear every word, but I saw the papers exchanged, saw Richard's shoulders slump as he signed. When the men left, Emily stood in the doorway, her face pale, her hand covering her mouth. That night, she came to me again. Tears streamed down her cheeks, her voice breaking. "Dad, I don't know how much longer I can do this. He's destroying everything. He blames you, but I know the truth now. You were the one holding us together." Her words were a balm I didn't know I needed. For years I had been invisible in her eyes. The man behind the curtain, the silent provider. Now she saw me. Now she understood. Meanwhile, Richard spiraled further. His friends abandoned him, his business contacts cut ties, his reputation in ruins. But even as he sank, he clung to his anger toward me. He came to my house one night, pounding on the door so hard the walls rattled. When I opened it, he was drunk, his words slurred, his breath reeking of whiskey. "You think you've won," he spat. "You think you've humiliated me. But I'll get back up. I'll rise again. And when I do, you'll regret every second of this." I looked him dead in the eye and said nothing. Silence again, the kind that burned worse than any insult. He staggered away, shouting curses into the night. But I knew the truth. He wasn't rising again. He was already too far gone. And then, as if fate itself wanted to strike the final blow, his company officially filed for bankruptcy. The announcement was in the local paper. "Jenkins Enterprises closes after financial collapse." The headline was small, tucked beneath larger stories. But in our town, it might as well have been front-page news. Everyone saw it. Everyone knew. The mighty Richard Jenkins had fallen. I folded the paper neatly, set it on my table, and poured myself a fresh cup of coffee. Outside, I could hear the faint sound of Emily crying in their backyard, and the silence of a man who no longer had the strength to shout. The downfall was complete. But I knew one thing for certain. Richard wasn't finished with me yet. Pride may break, but it never dies quietly. And I could feel it building, the storm he would try to unleash. It was late. The kind of night when the world feels heavier, when silence presses down so thick you can hear your own heart beating. I was sitting at my kitchen table, the paper folded neatly beside a cooling cup of coffee. Richard's bankruptcy notice was staring back at me in black and white. His empire had collapsed, and everyone knew it. But even in ruin, I knew him well enough to expect one final strike. A man like Richard doesn't just fade away. Pride doesn't die that easily. The knock came just after midnight, hard, insistent, rattling the frame of the door. I stood slowly, not startled, not afraid. I had been waiting. When I opened it, there he was. Richard Jenkins, or at least what was left of him. His hair was disheveled, his shirt stained, his eyes wild and bloodshot. He looked more like a man who had crawled out of a gutter than the polished son-in-law who once boasted about investments and golf clubs. "You did this," he snarled, his voice hoarse. "You destroyed me. You turned everyone against me." He staggered inside without invitation, slamming the door behind him, his fists clenched, his whole body trembling with rage. I didn't move. I only looked at him the way a man looks at a storm, steady, unshaken, knowing it will pass. "No, Richard," I said quietly. "You destroyed yourself. I only stopped carrying you." He let out a bitter laugh, though it cracked halfway through. "Stopped carrying me? You sabotaged me. You pulled the rug out from under me. You wanted me to fail." His voice rose with each word, spittle gathering at the corners of his mouth. "You're nothing but a bitter old man who couldn't stand to see me succeed." "Success," I said, stepping closer. "You call living on my money, my sacrifices, my sweat success? You never built a thing. You only took. And when you had the chance to show gratitude, you chose mockery. You chose arrogance. This," I gestured to his ruined state, "this is who you really are." For a moment, the fight left him. His shoulders slumped, his breath came ragged, and he looked almost human. But then his eyes hardened again, desperation replacing shame. He slammed his fist against my table, rattling the coffee cup. "I want it back," he growled. "The house, the money, the respect. You're going to fix this, Dennis. You're going to make a call the same way you made the first one. You'll call the bank, the collectors, whoever the hell you need to, and you'll undo this. Do it for Emily." The mention of her name stung, but not the way he intended. I thought of her tear-streaked face, the way her voice had cracked when she told me she couldn't take much more. He had used her as a shield for years, hiding behind her love to cover his own failures. And here he was, doing it again. "For Emily?" I said softly. "Everything I ever did was for Emily. And you? You used her as a pawn. You dragged her through. Your debts, your lies, your arrogance. Don't you dare stand in my home and pretend you care for her more than I do." His mask cracked then. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw it. Not rage, not arrogance, but fear. He was cornered. Every lie stripped away, every safety net gone. And yet, even in that moment, his pride wouldn't let him bow. "I'm not begging you," he snapped, though his voice betrayed him. "I'm demanding it. You'll do it or what?" I interrupted, my tone sharp as a blade. "What power do you have left, Richard? Who will listen to you? Who will follow you? Look around you. Your friends are gone. Your business is dead. The neighborhood laughs behind your back. Emily sees you for what you are. You have nothing. And still, you dare to demand." His lips trembled. He opened his mouth, then closed it. His fists unclenched slowly, his chest heaving as if the weight of my words pressed him down. The silence stretched long, heavy, until finally his knees buckled. He sank onto the floor, his hands gripping his hair, his breath coming in broken gasps. "You don't understand," he whispered. "I can't live like this. I can't be nothing." I looked down at him, the man who once sneered at me in front of guests, who called me a toilet king, who laughed while my sacrifices kept his castle standing. And now, here he was, on his knees in my kitchen, broken, desperate, humiliated. "You made yourself nothing," I said coldly. "And this is the throne you earned." The clock ticked in the silence. Richard stayed there, kneeling on the tile, his body shaking. For a long while, I thought he might finally break, finally admit defeat. But then he lifted his head, his eyes burning not with shame, but with a twisted kind of defiance. "This isn't over," he rasped. "I'll find a way. I'll claw my way back if it kills me. And when I do, you'll regret every second you sat there watching me fall." He pushed himself unsteadily to his feet, swaying, his face pale. Without another word, he staggered toward the door and slammed it shut behind him. The house shook with the impact, but I remained still, staring at the empty space he had left. My hand rested on the table, steady, firm. I knew then that his words weren't empty. Pride doesn't die quietly, and Richard Jenkins wasn't finished yet. After Richard staggered out of my house that night, the silence that followed was thick and heavy, but not uncomfortable. For the first time in years, I felt the balance had shifted entirely. He was no longer the man strutting through life on my back. He was a shadow of himself, trembling in my kitchen, begging without using the word. And yet, I knew him too well to believe that was the end. Pride is stubborn, and Richard's was a disease. He would fight, claw, lie, cheat, anything to pretend he still had power. So I decided it was time to finish what I had started. I had pulled the rug from under him, stripped him bare in front of neighbors, forced him to kneel. But he still clung to the illusion that he might rise again. I needed to take away the one thing he still had left, his claim to Emily's stability, to the house, to the family name. The next morning, I called John Harris, my banker, and Lopez, the debt collector. I explained that Richard was circling the drain, still hiding behind my daughter's name. "I want it clean," I said firmly. "No loose threads. I want every asset tied to my guarantees pulled back, every obligation settled through my terms, not his." John hesitated for only a moment. "You're certain, Dennis? Once we do this, he won't just be in debt. He'll be stripped down to nothing." I closed my eyes, thinking of that night at the dinner table. Richard raising his glass, the laughter, the words, "Toilet King, your rule is over." My hands tightened into fists. "I'm certain. End it." The machinery of finance is slow for most, but when you know the right levers, it can move like a hammer. Within days, Richard received notices that the house, the very castle he had boasted about, was no longer secure. Foreclosure loomed, not in months, but in weeks. His name was blacklisted from credit agencies. His accounts were frozen pending repayment. Even his business accounts, those he had opened quietly under separate names, were flagged and shut down. The news spread quickly. Neighbors didn't just whisper now, they stared openly. "He's losing the house," I overheard one woman murmur at the grocery store. "Emily and the kids will have to move in with her father." Shameful. Emily came to me soon after, her eyes wide with fear, clutching another stack of letters. "Dad," she whispered, "they're saying we're going to lose everything. The house, the car, even the furniture. Is it true?" I didn't answer immediately. I looked at her, at the woman who had once sat silent while her husband mocked me. But now she was broken too, not by me, but by him. Finally, I said softly, "You won't lose everything, Emily. You'll lose him, that's all." Tears welled in her eyes, and for the first time, she didn't defend him. She didn't excuse his arrogance or his temper. She only nodded, as though deep down, she knew it was true. The day of reckoning came faster than even I expected. It was a Thursday evening when the sheriff's car pulled up in front of their house, lights flashing. The papers were served, the foreclosure official, the eviction scheduled. Richard burst out the front door in a rage, shouting at the deputy, waving his arms wildly. Neighbors gathered at the edges of their lawns, watching the spectacle unfold. "You can't do this," Richard bellowed. "This is my house. I paid for this." The deputy remained calm, handing him the papers. "Sir, the documents are clear. The guarantor has withdrawn, and foreclosure is proceeding. You have 30 days. To vacate. Richard's face turned crimson. "Guarantor?" he spat, spinning around to face my porch. Our eyes locked across the distance, and in that moment, the entire neighborhood followed his gaze. They knew. They all knew. He stormed across the street, the papers crumpled in his fist, his voice shaking with rage. "You did this. You took my house, my life, everything. You think you're a king now? You think humiliating me makes you a man?" I stood slowly, deliberately, and stepped onto my porch. The crowd watched, silent, the tension thick in the air. "No, Richard," I said, my voice clear. "I don't think I'm a king. I just finally stopped letting a fool wear the crown I built. This house was never yours. This life was never yours. It was borrowed, and now the debt is paid." He lunged forward, his fist raised, but the deputy caught him by the arm, pulling him back. "That's enough, sir," the officer warned. "You need to leave the property." For the first time, Richard didn't fight. His strength left him, his knees buckled, and he sank to the ground in front of everyone. The man who once mocked me, who laughed as others jeered, now knelt in the dirt of his driveway, the weight of his collapse crushing him at last. His voice cracked, barely more than a whisper. "I have nothing." And I stepped closer, so only he could hear. "That's what you always were, Richard. Nothing. You just finally see it now." The crowd dispersed slowly, murmuring, shaking their heads, some with pity, most with disdain. Emily didn't move to comfort him. She walked across the street instead, into my yard, her eyes fixed on me. For the first time since her marriage, she stood at my side, not his. That night, their house sat dark and silent, the candles snuffed, the laughter long gone. Richard stayed inside, a hollow man surrounded by papers and debt, while Emily sat at my kitchen table, sipping tea with trembling hands. She didn't speak much, but when she finally did, her words carried the weight of years. "Dad," she whispered, "thank you for showing me the truth." And in that moment, I knew the last blow had landed, not just on Richard, but on the illusion he had wrapped my daughter in. His reign was over. My silence, my patience, my revenge, all of it had brought me here. The toilet king he mocked was gone. What stood now was a father who had taken back his crown, not of arrogance, but of quiet justice. As I sat on my porch in the quiet that followed, coffee cup warm in my hand, I thought back to that night, months earlier. The laughter, the humiliation, Richard's smug face as he called me a toilet king. I remembered the sting of it, the silence of my daughter as she let the insult pass, and the rage I buried deep instead of unleashing. Now, everything had changed. The man who mocked me had been stripped of every illusion, forced to his knees not by my fists, but by the truth. Emily finally saw what I had carried all these years, the sacrifices I had made, the weight I had borne in silence. My revenge had not been loud, not violent. It had been patient, precise, and absolute. And as the night deepened, I realized something important. Revenge is not about the satisfaction of their suffering. It's about reclaiming your dignity, your voice, your crown, even if they once mocked it. Richard had taken my sacrifices for weakness. But in the end, it was those very sacrifices that gave me the power to end him. Some kings rule with noise and arrogance. Others rule in silence. I chose silence, and it brought me justice. If you like this story, subscribe and tell us your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, click on the box on the screen.